Hello and welcome back. Good morning to everyone joining us from the United States, and good afternoon to everyone joining us in Europe. This afternoon we're going to be having several panels looking at some challenges for NATO that are coming up, also some potential fault lines that could come in the alliance. Things like democracy, resilience, the rules-based international order, values. Christine, what could the NATO's potential role be as an international actor on these issues?
Thank you so much. I mean, we come off of a morning where we look at all the potential, the challenges that NATO has to cover, from great power politics to, with Russia and China, to some of the systemic challenges from technology to climate change. And now we're looking, really diving into some of these other questions that many maybe don't think are quite as central or key to NATO. If you look at values, the democracy, rule of law are really at the heart of NATO, are in the founding treaty. And so, of course, these are important, but right now they're becoming more important because the adversaries that NATO has, China, Russia, don't find these compatible with their own systems and their role in the world. So this is really something that is becoming and growing as a more important thing for leaders to be focusing on, even though this brings up very hard questions at home.
Thanks, Christine. We're now going to head over to Washington for a panel on contributing to stability. And so I'm going to hand over to Kevin Barron.
Hello and welcome to our latest session here at Brussels Forum for the NATO Summit Day. This session is called On the Ground, Contributing to Stability. We're first going to hear two videos from two of our NATO heads of state, starting out with Turkey's President Erdogan. So let's listen to that now.
Saygıdeğer panelistler, kıymetli katılımcılar, sizleri şahsım ve milletim adına en kalbi duygularımla selamlıyorum. Dünyanın asimetrik tehditlerle yüzleştiği sancılı bir dönemde düzenlenen sempozyumun tüm insanlık için hayırlara vesile olmasını diliyorum. Teknolojik gelişmeler, demografik baskılar, iklim değişikliği, terör, düzensiz göç ve koronavirüs salgını yeni sınamaları beraberinde getiriyor. Bu durum zorunlu olarak güvenlik ve istikrara dair bakışımızı da etkilemekte. Bu konuları bütüncül bir vizyonla ele almamızı zorlamaktadır. Türkiye bu anlayışla bölgesinde ve ötesinde güvenilir bir müttefik olarak üzerine düşeni fazlasıyla yerine getirmektedir. Sahadaki sorunların özellikle çözümünde inisiyatif alan, insani boyutu öne çıkaran, yapıcı ve aktif bir siyaset uyguluyoruz. Irak'tan Afganistan'a, Kafkaslardan Balkanlara, Karadeniz'den Akdeniz'e, Afrika'ya kadar istikrarın tesisine yönelik tüm girişimlere öncülük ediyor, katkı sağlıyoruz. Komşularımızla ilişkilerimizde uluslararası hukuka, adalet ve hakkaniyete, karşılıklı hak ve çıkarlara saygıyı gözetiyoruz. Komşumuz ve müttefikimiz Yunanistan'la aramızdaki diyalog kanallarının canlandırılmasının, ikili meselelerin çözümünün bölgemizin özellikle istikrar ve refahına da hizmet ettiğine inanıyorum. Kıymetli dostlarım, günümüzde istikrarın tesisinin önündeki en büyük engellerden biri terördür. Türkiye, NATO başta olmak üzere ilgili tüm uluslararası platformlarda terörle mücadelede ilk safta yer almaktadır. PKK, PYD'den DAEŞ ve FETÖ'ye kadar birçok terör örgütüyle sınırlarımız içinde ve dışında yoğun bir mücadelenin içindeyiz. DAEŞ'ta göğüs göğüse çarpışan ve bu uğurda gencecik evlatlarını şehit veren tek NATO müttefikiyiz. Sınır ötesi operasyonlarımızda 4000'e yakın DAEŞ'li teröristi etkisiz hale getirdik. Terörün her türlüsüne karşı yürüttüğümüz mücadelede maalesef müttefik ve ortaklarımızdan beklediğimiz destek ve dayanışmayı göremedik. Suriye, Irak ve Türkiye'de eli Müslümanların kanına bulaşmış terör örgütü elebaşılarının meşru bir aktör gibi en üst seviyede muhatap alındığına, desteklendiğine şahit olduk. Unutulmamalıdır ki Türkiye'nin sınırları aynı zamanda NATO'nun sınırlarıdır. Bu bakımdan sadece kendi milli menfaatlerimiz için değil, transatlantik coğrafyasının güvenlik ve istikrarının temini içinde önemli bir sorumluluk üstlendiğimizi biliyoruz. Adımları bu bilinçle atıyoruz. Türkiye, NATO harekat ve misyonlarına en çok katkı sağlayan ilk 5, ortak bütçeye en fazla katkı veren ilk 8 müttefik arasında yer alıyor. Çok yüksek hazırlık seviyeli müşterek görev kuvvetinin komutası da bu sene Türkiye'dedir. İttifakın en büyük ikinci ordusuna sahip olan Türkiye, NATO'nun güncel tehdit ve imtihanlara karşı adaptasyonu için aktif rol oynamaktadır. Hazırlıklı olabilmek bakımından müttefikler olarak atacağımız adımlar kadar ortaklarımızın kapasite geliştirmelerine yapacağı katkılar da önemlidir. Türkiye, dinamik ekonomisi, güçlü savunma sanayi, ilkeli dış politikası ve müttefikleriyle işbirliği içinde küresel barış, refah ve istikrarını özellikle bunu geliştirmeyi sürdürecektir. Bu düşüncelerle sözlerime son verirken bu zorlu süreçte dayanışma ve işbirliği içerisinde hareket etmenin önemini tekrar vurgulamak istiyorum. Etkinliğin düzenlenmesinde emeği geçen herkese teşekkür ediyorum. Sizleri bir kez daha saygıyla selamlıyorum. Kalın sağlıcakla.
Second message from the Prime Minister of Greece, Kyriakos Mitsotakis.
Secretary General, ambassadors, ladies and gentlemen, as NATO meets in Brussels this week, minds turn inevitably to the future, to a life beyond the pandemic, to getting back to how things were before. However, if the last year has taught us anything, it is that there is no going back to life before COVID. Rather, we must strengthen our institutions in order to better manage the complex range of threats we face going forward. If we are to contribute to stability, we must take action in the present on the issues that we know we will face in the future. And we must do so by strengthening multilateral institutions like NATO. Stability is, after all, the sum of our collective responsibility. The road ahead will be bumpy. Huge tectonic shifts are underway. Our world faces massive challenges, profoundly different to many of those we faced in the past. Take COVID and climate change. Both have accelerated inequality, not just between rich countries and poor, but between the elite and the mass. Both have the potential to bend the world towards unilateralism and away from multilateralism. And both, if not collectively managed, bring huge geopolitical and security risks. We are already seeing the geopolitical impact of warming temperatures, principally on mass migration. Unless we take action soon, global warming will present a clear and present danger to our security and our way of life. And yet, there remains a huge chasm to bridge between our rhetoric and our action. COVID-2 was not a surprise to the scientists, the epidemiologists, the virologists. Yet here in Europe, we were ill-prepared for its devastating effects, instead having to rely on crisis management and an unprecedented economic stimulus. We cannot make that mistake again. Stability in the future requires investment in the present. We must take necessary steps today to prepare for the predictable shocks of tomorrow. And of course, in amongst these challenges, autocrats flex their muscles, threatening the stability of our rules-based system. They deploy advanced tools to destabilize, divide, and disrupt. Third-party proxies spread confusion and chaos, threaten the rule of law, and seek to undermine open and democratic societies. Our adversaries have exploited public discontent and successfully stoked anti-establishment, anti-institution feelings, fermenting a radically different geopolitical vision of the future in the process. The result is that what was once bubbling under the surface is now boiling in the pan. Contributing to stability means taking action on these issues and others, not waiting for tomorrow, not playing politics in pursuit of self-interest, rather grasping the nettle and acting now. NATO has a key role to play here. Our pledge to safeguard the shared foundations of our transatlantic bond, to defend our common interests in unity and solidarity, must now more than ever be more than words. Yes, our collective responsibility to maintain and strengthen international peace and stability cannot and should not tolerate new dividing lines. But we must also be a solutions-based organization, building common understanding through collective action. Our societies want leaders to step up and to act. We must not let them down.
Buddy, I think we have a good panel set for you to talk about NATO in the South and its neighbors in the region. So let me quickly introduce them and we can get started. We have Ambassador Tajan Ildem, this former Assistant Secretary General of NATO, retired Admiral James Fogo, Distinguished Fellow now at the Transatlantic Security Defense Program at the Center for European Policy Analysis, and the Honorable Christina Gallac, State Secretary for Foreign Affairs and for Ibero-America and the Caribbean, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the European Union and Cooperation Spain. And she has the best title of all of us today. But we're going to start with Ambassador Ildem because he said he was one of the working group members for the NATO 2030 project. So please tell us about that work that you did and how it relates, whatever the findings were, to what we're going to talk about today, NATO in the South.
Conducted all of its meetings virtually. For the 8 months, we had long deliberations, and certainly the topic of discussion for today was dealt with in detail. There are a couple of things that I may highlight, which we also included in our report. First of all, NATO has been involved in the region for some time already. It has conducted operations, has been involved in training and capacity building, and has formed partnerships with countries in the Middle East and North Africa through Mediterranean Dialogue and Istanbul Cooperation Initiative. Furthermore, NATO has been part of the global coalition to defeat ISIL-Daesh since 2017. So what we thought was that it would be good for NATO to articulate a clear, coherent approach for the South. And I know from my past experience that when we talked about deterrence and defense, we usually remembered threat coming from the East, but neglecting the South. Whereas there are a number of challenges we are facing in the South, and we need to strengthen our deterrence and defense. Take, for instance, maritime security. And there are already good work in place, like the establishment of the hub for the South. There is the framework for the South, and also advanced plans to be revised and delivered. I think these are things we should give priority to. Second, while talking about threats coming from different directions, east and south, we can no longer compartmentalize Russian threat only with one geography, because Russia right now is gaining power base in the south, having bridgeheads established in Syria and Libya, and of course the policies that they have been implementing are not something that we could agree. To a lesser extent, we also see China's presence growing in the Mediterranean and in North Africa. Perhaps the interests of both Russia and China right now are not similar, because whatever Russia does is somewhat detrimental to the interests of NATO, whereas China is more focused on economy, investments, so that there can be a differentiation made in that respect. We need to strengthen the existing partnerships, re-energize Mediterranean dialogue and Istanbul Cooperation Initiative, and at the same time we should be able to engage more with partners, with political discussions, dialogue, practical cooperation, at a time when we talk about strengthening the political dimension of NATO. Partnerships are important political tools, instruments. In general, we thought that while dealing with partnerships, NATO can shift from only demand-driven approach to interest-driven approach, and both allies and partners should be able to know what they are expected in this engagement. So a clear blueprint for partnerships would be useful. I should also mention the importance of comprehensive approach and how to cooperate and engage with other international and regional organizations. First and foremost, the European Union, but also African Union, League of Arab States, and also International Islamic Cooperation Organization, Gulf Cooperation Council. All these are relevant and important for NATO to engage. One last thing, when we talk about these partners, we could see that whatever is happening in sub-Saharan Africa and Sahel region, they have a direct or indirect impact in security circumstances in North Africa. Therefore, NATO should also be able to engage with G5 Sahel grouping to have a better understanding about the threats and challenges emanating from that region that have an immediate and direct bearing on North Africa. Perhaps at this stage, I limit my remarks at this point. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I wanted to hear from you first, and so that you could do what you just did, lay out all of these structural elements and agreements and considerations that are before NATO. You know, those of us who've covered NATO for a while, we've been through periods of NATO reform before, right? And it kind of feels like this is another NATO reform. There's a new strategic concept that's due today, the first in 10 years. But I often remind people that all of these processes and agreements happen amid politics and with populations that have opinions. And I just wanted to point out a couple of things because there are some new polling results in America about how, and abroad, about how countries and their citizens, their nations, either approve of NATO or don't, or want to be engaged in the world or don't. And here in the United States, where I'm broadcasting from today, we have a war-weary public against forever wars, which lots of people think means involvement in the regions we're talking about here, right? Just across the Med in North Africa and in the Middle East, areas where Admiral Fogo had a lot of responsibility recently. And in the last couple of weeks, we've seen France pull out of Mali or restructure its forces in Mali, asking for greater international cooperation, greater international help to fight terrorism, the same thing the United States has done. So you have two things happening. You have NATO member states asking for more cooperation and help, while NATO member publics seem to not want to be as involved abroad. Secretary Galyak, from your perspective, what is the argument, once again, if we have to make it, of why NATO should either be involved in these conflicts across the sea or in the politics of them, and how having involvement somehow helps your country's foreign policy to the better?
Thank you very much, first of all, for inviting me to this panel, and particularly for discussing this issue of the security, the southern neighborhood of NATO. Spain is a southern ally, and we are truly committed to this region and truly committed to project security and stability to our neighbors in the south. And let me start by taking the first sentence of the report that the Realdem was part of, in particular of the chapter on South, because it says, when NATO's neighbors are more secure, NATO is more secure. And I should say clearly, NATO's neighbors in the South are less secure and project, unfortunately, more instability to us than probably ever before. We just have to look at the manner in which, the extremism, jihadism has moved from Afghanistan, Iraq, and now it is at the center of the Sahel, and now tries to go down to the Gulf of Guinea. I was just very recently in some of the countries in the Gulf of Guinea, and there is a major worry from Ghana to Ivory Coast, etc., that there might be a connection between the Sahelian-based jihadis, Daesh, ISIS, etc., and the piracy in the Gulf of Guinea. So I think first statement, our neighbors in the south are more insecure than they have been, and therefore we as NATO, we have both a responsibility towards our security and a projection of stability towards them. Then another point, the nature of the threat coming from the region, Northern Africa, Sahel, etc., is a very complex nature. It stems from problems that come through instabilities, political instabilities. We talked about terrorism already, migration, which per se, if it is regulated, is a positive movement, but now is totally unregulated and truly poses a major challenge. And if we move a little bit further from the Sahelian, a little bit north, Libya is in a better situation, but it is not the same with Syria. It is not the same with some parts of the MENA region. So I am convinced, and Spain is convinced, that we have to find the adequate and appropriate way to engage with the region, considering that boots on the ground is probably a no-go. considering that we have a dialogue, a Mediterranean dialogue. Ambassador Yildirim was talking about it, that needs to be revamped, considering that China and Russia, as it has been mentioned, do play a major role. China, with its global approach, very technological, with the interest in using the rules, with the threat that emanates from Russia on cyber cyber security, cyber, etc. So yes, we really need to think about the South, think it thoroughly. We like what is in the document that was presented by the panel of experts, but I think among the allies we have to think it further. And let me make a few comments on what we can do. I think coherence is very important. There are so many actors, our allies bilateral. It has been mentioned the role of France. You have been mentioned the role of France, that is looking at, rethinking about Mali and the Sahel region. Spain is present there with more than 500 troops with the EU operation, but we are also supporting one of the France-led operations, Barkhane, which is one that is probably in the process of changing. So coherence is very important. The 360 approach needs to be probably rethought and made more precise. Very important. And 360 goes by that region. We cannot just have a 360 some in other parts. I think it's key, 360 for the region. Let me also mention the interest-driven approach. I think it's very important. It is not a demand, it's more our allies, us, we are interested. So looking at that and in how NATO can add value, because we know other organizations, it also has been mentioned, the European Union, UN, we have huge military presence, peacekeepers, UN peacekeepers, for example, MINUSCO in Sahel. And I think the last key point is what to do and how to do it. I think that's clear. How do we revamp the dialogue with the Mediterranean countries? But what can we do? And I would point at training, very, very, very important, and security advice to Sahel, the 5 Sahel countries. It is fundamental. Cyber, and really look at what is the best presence, because some of the presence might be even more destabilizing than others. I think the presence that already China and Russia have in the region needs to be rebalanced somehow. China, although maybe less military presence in the Sahel, but yes, in Djibouti, and Russia in Libya. So for us, and now I'm speaking as a Spanish vice minister, it is key. And these 10 years that we have now in front of us, that will be, you know, will be at the, you know, looking at how do we reinforce NATO and the NATO actions. I think the southern part needs to be more at the center than it has been in the past in NATO. Over to you.
Thank you, and that's a good segue to bring in Admiral Fogel. You know, Admiral, we're not the #1 panel for this week, right? Because we're not talking about China. China seems to be all that we're hearing about from the G7 this weekend to NATO. And it just makes me think, you know, the last 20 years, the priority for NATO outside of NATO was this region we're talking about. It was the Middle East and North Africa, and of course, Afghanistan. And the Secretary makes a good point that right now there is increasing instability, not decreasing across these regions. I mean, that's the reason that that President Macron gave for pulling forces from Mali was because of the killing of its leader, the coup there. It wasn't safe enough to keep his troops alone. So you were most recently, very recently, commander of U.S. Naval Forces Europe and Africa and the Joint Command, Allied Joint Command. So from your perspective, are we in danger of overlooking this region because of the focus on China? And what have you seen or done in the last recent years that you think is either the right amount or maybe needs to change when it comes to NATO's attention to this region that you were so close to?
Well, Kevin, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here representing Center for European Policy Analysis, and on behalf of Dr. Alina Palnikova, who's our president and CEO. We're delighted to represent today in the Brussels Forum with Ambassador Hilden and Minister Gallic. Minister Gallic, who I know and have seen frequently throughout NATO interactions. So you're absolutely right. It is a powder keg of a region that we are talking about, NATO's strategic direction south, defined as not just Africa, as my Turkish friends will remind me, but also the Middle East. So Middle East, North Africa, but you heard a lot talk about the Sahel today. I submit that you cannot talk about this region without talking about China. So it should be a focus of the discussion in this fortnight of summitry we're going through in Brussels. Now, I know Secretary General Stoltenberg is extremely interested in Direction South. He told me so when we brought the hub into existence. My predecessor, Admiral Howard, started with initial operational capability of something we call the NATO Strategic Direction South Hub. It was to complete the comprehensive approach in that 360 degrees, which the Secretary General himself said, doing okay in the north, we're doing better in the east, we're not doing so well in the south. And what are we doing about it? I tell my American friends, we ignore Africa and the Middle East at our own peril. There is a nexus between terrorism and illegal trafficking, particularly in the Sahel region that Mr. Gallic alluded to. And we have seen this as traffickers in narcotics, illegal weapons, and most importantly, human trafficking, migrate from the Sahel up into places like Libya, across the Mediterranean, and into Europe. So what happens in this region not only impacts Europe and its security and stability, but invariably will impact the United States of America in the long term. That's why this focus, this transatlantic bridge, this working together is so important. You know, what can we do about it? There's a lot of terrorist organizations on the continent of Africa. Al-Shabaab in the east, Boko Haram around the Lake Chad Basin, West Africa, one of the worst terrorist organizations and becoming stronger every day. It is indeed a shame that the French had to reduce their footprint in Africa. Now, you know, there's things that we can do to help our African friends. And another important thing about this is we're not there to do the job for African partners. We seek African solutions to African problems, enable and facilitate, and we conduct development to try to help them out. You have to have agreements between large organizations in order to figure this out. I think NATO and the EU are perfect European and transatlantic organizations, international organizations that can partner with the African Union. And we've actually done that through Hub by signing a memorandum of agreement. Last year's NRF exercise was the first time that Jupiter Jackal actually brought in members of the African standing armies to consult on what we were doing in this pretty much a live exercise, but talking about crisis response potentially on the African continent. You know, we've got to get migration in the Mediterranean under control. Both of our guest speakers alluded to the fact that Libya is a little more stable problem in a frozen conflict. And we have Russia on one side and we have NATO allies and partners on the other. We've got to resolve that issue. In the Middle East, not just to talk about Africa, NATO has an important mission. One of the things I did as Commander Naval Forces Naples was to stand up the NATO mission in Iraq. So we got almost 500 people on the ground before the elimination of General Soleimani. We downsized and descoped, and now we're back and we have a firm mandate as NATO to continue that mission. I think it's a very, very important mission. We had our first female commander, Major General Jenny Carignan, who had incredible energy while she was there for a year. And I'd also like to say that, one of the things in the report that Ambassador Ildem and our own Dr. Wes Mitchell, Center for European Policy Analysis, underscored, it's not just about security on the continent of Africa and the Middle East, but women in peace and security. And we have Minister Gallick with us here today, and she can probably comment on UN Security Council 13.5's resolution that's now 20 years old, and we still have lots of work to do there. So these are all problems that occur in the battlefield today. The best thing NATO can do, and my friend, the Supreme Allied Commander, say, 90% of what we do in NATO and Allied command operations is deterrence, and the other 10% is to defend. So we increase the risk calculus for anybody who would want to attack us. NATO doesn't go looking for, offensive grab of territory the way that Crimea was illegally annexed. We defend the territory we have, and we send a very strong message to any adversaries that might want to impugn upon that territory in the Washington Treaty of 1949 and Article 5. It's very, very important. There are actors out there like the Chinese who, frankly, are all over the African continent. Note that because their economic interests and their investments, stability hasn't really improved, has it? Minister Gallick mentioned Djibouti. It was one of the bases I had oversight for as an admiral in Europe, and I went down there frequently. The Chinese arrived, they brought their own labor. The United States of America actually spends 14% of Djiboutian GDP on investment there, and hires a lot of Djiboutian people who work on our base in Camp Lemonnier, a former French base. I don't see the same thing from the Chinese. So it's fine if they want to rise peacefully and invest all over the world, but if they want to be a great power, they have great responsibility, like everybody else in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, to do the right thing and help our partners. So if we come together, and I believe that this week of summits has shown we are back together as a group, as a transatlantic bridge to help one another out, we can tackle a lot of these problems, but it's a huge agenda. Last thing I'll say is I was very proud of the NATO report for calling out something that hasn't been mentioned today, and that is time for a new NATO maritime strategy. The last one was in 2011, before the return of Russia, before the rise of China, before the illegal annexation of Ukraine, before a lot of traffic and a lot of climate change and a lot of open water in the Arctic, or the place that I call the Transpolar Bridge. So to quote my friend Robert Kaplan, the great author here in the United States, this is not just the maritime decade, it's the maritime century. A lot of these problems that we're talking about in Africa and the Middle East are in the blue economies, particularly Gulf of Guinea, as Minister Gallick mentioned. And we've been down there for over a decade, a lot longer than the Chinese. So our relationships are pretty strong down there, and we can help. Thanks for the opportunity to comment, Kevin. Very interesting remarks from you and our speakers, and back over to you for the next round of questions.
Thank you, sir. Spoken like a true admiral to end with a pitch for maritime security. Well done. But, it's a good point. In sticky geopolitics, often it's the maritime relationship that's the one that is most able to hold true, or that is able to cut below the politics. When there's heated talk among heads of state, these maritime, agreements seem to survive all of that. And I wanted to ask Ambassador Ildem and also Secretary Gallick, the politics of the moment might disagree a little bit with the talk of a revitalized transatlantic alliance so that everything is fine. I assume a lot of the headlines today are going to focus on the meeting between Erdogan and Biden, and they're not going to be friendly. They're going to be very critical about what is Turkey's role in the alliance, and how powerful is Biden as a new president. Can he really pull things together like he's claiming that he wants to or can, in a way differently than President Trump could or couldn't? So when it comes to this region, again, specifically, when you think of great power competition, what's the reality of the storyline that we may not hear after today when it comes to how all of your countries, or not just where you're from, but all the NATO countries in the region, either are already coming together or something new that needs to be done, so that when we come back next year, we're not using the same language talking about security deteriorating and terrorist groups stronger than ever, phrases that the Admiral was just using, which is hard to hear after so much time and investment spent. Like I said, when nations and electorates back at home are saying something different. Ambassador Idlem, what do you think to that? What happened?
A positive outcome, which will be something fitting to the spirit of alliancehood that should govern the relations between allies. I would like to highlight few points also relevant for the work of our group, which was to come up with recommendations to strengthen the political dimension of NATO. When we talk about this role, elevated role, NATO should be used more as a forum of allied consultations on all security issues that relate to individual allies, and in the cases even when NATO is not first responder. So there may be differences of how to approach certain crisis situation or potential challenges among allies, and they can only be addressed and have a harmonious appreciation and way forward by discussing among them. Second, we mentioned a lot about terrorism. Yes, it is important to strengthen the capacity of our partners in the southern periphery. But we should also be able to have a clear eye on what we mean by terrorism. And we, in our report, stated that terrorism in all its forms and manifestations poses an immediate and persistent asymmetric threat to our nations and citizens. And we should be able to promote a better understanding regarding terrorism threat, how allies should show solidarity and cooperate among themselves, and also in the field of qualification of groups, because I don't think that it would be to the advantage of NATO countries to have good terrorists and bad terrorists. Terrorists should be treated equally, and only through effective political consultation among allies we could be able to reach that kind of understanding. I very much support what Admiral Foggo has said. The direct connection between Mediterranean and European security is most obvious in the area of maritime security, and this requires to sharpen our focus with a maritime strategy. Thank you.
Thank you, and we're down to our last couple of minutes, so Secretary Galliard.
Thank you very much. I can only agree that we need to straighten up our maritime strategy. If we look at what happened in the Horn of Africa, it was through cooperation, EU cooperation in particular, and quite efficient ad hoc support that we managed to tackle the piracy off the coast of Somalia. Something like this we need to do for the Gulf of Guinea, because that's another extremely important passage for energy supplies to Europe and all sorts of trade from Asia, but also from Africa. And we expect to trade more and more from Africa. And then if we look at the Sahel, I would like to mention, we are talking to the French a lot, and we expect that the statements about redefining Takuba and Barkhane, key operations there, will not mean a decrease of the presence, because that would be a bad signal to terrorism, but maybe more a reshuffle of what the missions will be. You know, Takuba is more of a strongly anti-terrorism groups. Barkhane is more support. Spain is providing air transport for Barkhane troops. So I think that's important to say. Otherwise, we will be giving in, and we cannot. We have seen in the last period of months, in particularly, immense problems in Burkina Faso, immense problems in Mali of all sorts of nature, including political, which we are helping, and we are really extremely active in Niger and working very well with Mauritania. And I think here we have to underline the good dialogue that NATO holds with Mauritania as part of the Mediterranean dialogue. So the key, let me repeat it again, how do we engage? In which way we make these countries more secure and not threaten the what goes on in terms of the presence of more outside goods, but on the contrary, looking at what is our best contribution, and in addition, how do we link this with the Southern Mediterranean part, in which we have a dialogue, which we think we need to strengthen. I can only agree that we need to have more political dialogue on issues in which, on areas and countries on which NATO will not be the key organization to act immediately, but yes, can provide a fantastic platform for the deterrence that it was being talked about, which we think is very important.
Thanks. And Jamie, do you have a final reaction in 10 seconds or less? What do you want to see come out of this day at NATO?
Thanks, Kevin. Very briefly, we talked a lot about deterrence and defense and deter and defend in the Euro-Atlantic region, and that's coming from NATO civilians and military officials. But one thing the Secretary General also added into the mix, the 3 Ds, deter, defend, and dialogue. So great dialogue at the G7. I see a dialogue underway at NATO and in the EU. Our president and the United States of America are back in the game. We're going to have a dialogue with President Erdogan. I think that's very, very important as a very important and effective NATO ally. And finally, a dialogue, which has been lacking for a long time, with President Putin of Russia. And it may be at the lowest point of the relationship, as both presidents have agreed, but that dialogue is really important. So we know where we stand and we can move forward from here. So this week, very important as we get after all of these problems we talked about today by working them out, speaking about them, and having this important dialogue. It's essential. And thanks so much for the opportunity to wrap up here.
Thank you, and thank you to all our panelists. I think there's still more to come today from Brussels with NATO, and as you said, the Biden-Putin meeting later this week. It's quite an extraordinary week for those of us following foreign policy and international relations. And whether or not NATO needs revitalizing or revamping, who knows? But I think we're going to see a lot more out of these documents with NATO 2030 and the agreements today. And I'm most curious to see what our host nation publics and electorates think back home about all of it. So thank you all for joining us. We're going to throw it back to Brussels for the next session. I'm Kevin Barron, again, the executive editor of Defense One. Thank you for joining us.